First of all, I'd like to welcome you to the program. I've been on your show a couple of times. It's great to have you here. And people in Brazil might know you from the little video you did, kind of documentary about Lula, which we showed on 247 and was really well received. So you're someone who in the United States has been really a key person for helping change this narrative that they had in the media about Lula. And what was really pernicious about this narrative is that a lot of publications that people who think of themselves as being progressive or liberal or whatever, such as the New York Times or the Guardian, had just followed this kind of false narrative generated maybe with support from the State Department even, or the DOJ, that Lula was involved in this incredible amount of corruption. And so first I'd like to ask you, how did you first get involved in trying to change this?
So I first heard about President Lula probably when I was just before I was starting college, when he became president. And I was politically active to some extent and interested in what was happening in Latin America. So I was aware of him. Fast forward to what I do now as a talk show host and a political analyst in New York. And I had followed what happened in 2016 a little bit. And then I saw basically that he was about to go to jail in 2018. And I followed my instincts that it was an important story and that the presentation of it was massively distorted. And I saw it in sort of three key ways. One was, this is a very significant leader who's going to become a political prisoner. That matters in and of itself. And I would cover that to the extent I could if that happened anywhere in the globe, right? A leader of the left who'd accomplished incredible things and was going to go to jail in a politicized process. That's number one. Two, I think that it was an opportunity to talk about a whole bigger set of issues like U.S. foreign policy, but even also the way some people on the left in the United States, but I even think globally, can be so purely idealistic about their politics that they don't have a power analysis of how things actually work at times. So I even thought, there was like a purity left critique of President Lula's record, which needed to be answered. And again, had implications for how people were dealing with the moment we were in everywhere. And then, number three, Brazil is the largest country in Latin America. And I think if you want to have some foothold in terms of our hemisphere, you have to have a sense of what's going on there.
All right. So I think it's interesting, this idea of this leftist purity. I find it really annoying when I was trying to convince people up in the United States. I remember once someone wrote into a radio show I come on a lot and said, why is Brian talking about this coup against Dilma Rousseff? Why isn't he criticizing Dilma Rousseff from the left? I think everyone listening to your show would think that there's a coup going on, but he needs to criticize her more from the left. And it's like, there's a right and a wrong time for everything. And I think this kind of ties into the Brexit in a way, because I saw these articles like the left argument for Brexit that took England out of its geopolitical context, as if England leaves the European Union, then all of a sudden it's just going to be this autonomous country. And the documents that Jeremy Corbyn released 2 weeks ago clearly show that the goal behind Brexit was to turn the public health department over to the American pharmaceutical industry. The pro-left Brexit analysis didn't take that into what the US would do to the UK if it left the European Union into context,
That's such a great analogy. And I had a lot of sympathy for left Brexit analysis. And I also had sympathy for, of course, there's valid critiques of, look, literally anybody who occupies a position of power, there's going to be a valid critique marshaled of them, particularly in a global capitalist system. But I think that, yes, that's really, really important, right? Yes, there are these valid left Brexit critiques, but the reality is that that isn't on the table. The only thing that's on the table is right-wing xenophobic populism, and then right-wing forces that actually see Brexit as a great example for primitive accumulation and disaster capitalism. And so, right, you're not looking at the geostrategic context. And I was relieved because I was really just in the first couple of years of doing stuff like this in 2016, and I had nowhere near, my look, I'm independent media, obviously, but my reach has certainly grown significantly than where it was in 2016. But I was worried because I did a couple episodes on Brazil, and I have to say I was relieved that I still came out on the right position, that it was a coup. But I think that I still was, that discourse of looking for critique and left purity. I mean, I think that it is a balance you have to strike. I mean, some people, particularly in the United States, there's sort of two left positions. Some people say, oh, you're arrayed against the United States, you're good. That's it. Other people are gonna say to, you saw some self-identified liberals are defending the coup in Bolivia, for Christ's sake, and, or a coup in Venezuela. And it's usually on grounds that, Maduro and Evo Morales are not Christ-like. They are not the perfect hybrid of John Locke and Doctors Without Borders and, whatever else these people have in their fantasy lives. But you have to strike the balance there. And I think that, and one of the things, though, that's so interesting about Brazil is that, and is so revealing, is that this isn't like talking about Cuba or something in the United States, where I do think you need to have I have a principled defense of a revolutionary project, but there's no question that Cuba is not, it's definitionally not a liberal democracy. In Lula and the Workers' Party, you had someone who literally is a political prisoner. The president is connected to Rio de Janeiro militias, wouldn't be president without him being a political prisoner. The guy gets out of jail and says, we're still going to respect the mandate. It's just people should participate more in democracy and politics. Well, that's what all these, excuse my language, fucking people are always rambling about wanting to see everywhere. And then when they see it, then they buy into a two-bit lie corruption narrative about the very same forces promoting essentially social democracy in a developing context. It's ridiculous.
How do you see the press coverage up there on Lula's release from jail? It looked like some elements of the press were panicking a little bit about him getting out of jail, to me.
Well, I definitely think on the right there was. I mean, I know that Sloppy Steve Bannon, said that Lula was a big symbol of globalists everywhere. And what's funny is, of course, he's wrong in the sense that he means it. Because Lula is not a neoliberal leader in contrast to what Steve thinks and maybe some Trotskyite factions, but he is a symbol of global decency, is how I'd put it, like a Bernie Sanders or a Jeremy Corbyn. The mainstream press, I would say that, there's been some change in the coverage of Lula in a positive direction in the sense that some of them are covering it in the context of Bernie Sanders' foreign policy. And then there's a little bit, there was a kind of flurry of, oh, this guy got released from prison. But, big picture, Brian, most pieces, they didn't even talk about the Intercept revelations. They didn't even say, the clearly documented reality that at the very least, the sets of charges that put him in had been, I'm trying to think of how you'd cover it objectively, but they didn't, no, the coverage was still essentially like, it glossed over the major revelations, and then it sort of went to a new narrative, which is, this is going to really polarize Brazil. This is going to, that was the big mainstream media narrative. This is going to polarize Brazil.
Yeah, I saw one guy, Brian Winter, was former Reuters bureau chief down here, and is a guy who works for this think tank called ASCOA, which just generates misinformation about Brazil, about all of Latin America, really, in favor of the corporations that finance the groups, such as Boeing, Chevron, ExxonMobil, that all benefited from the 2016 coup. I saw that he has started trying to blame what's going on in Brazil today on the mediocrity of the Brazilian people. And I just find that infuriating, because here's a guy who made his whole career for the last 15 years out of being a Brazil specialist. And now he's saying Brazilians are mediocre because he helped put Bolsonaro in power. He put Sergio Moro, dressed up like one of Ghostbusters, on the cover of his magazine, America's Quarterly, and his assistant editor from that period is now Latin America bureau chief for the New York Times. So he was a major player in Bolsonaro coming to power, and now he's trying to say that this has all happened because Brazilians are mediocre. And I just found that infuriating, I hope that isn't a new trend.
It fits a global pattern. I mean, people don't. There's actually really interesting research that David Adler did showing that the center, quote unquote, in politics is actually the most opposed to democracy. So even if you pull out people who identify on the much further right, now, they mean democracy usually in a pretty narrow sense, like you fight elections. They're not talking about civil rights and social protections, obviously. But they do believe in some idea of democratic mandate, at least according to the polls. The most skeptical are people who identify in this center lane. And so right now in the global conflict between this resurgent far right, Trump, Bolsonaro, and these types of people, and then people like Sanders and Lula, and who are trying to present a real alternative, and in Lula's case actually has achieved as president already something to prevent this. Then you have this dead neoliberal center, and their main mission in life, I mean, Brazil's such a perfect example of this. Enrique Cardoso didn't say, hey, I'm a neoliberal, whatever, I hate the Workers' Party, but we need to stop Bolsonaro because he's anti-democratic, and he said I should have been killed. No, he didn't say that. He said, it's corruption, blah, blah, blah. And I think you can see in that a deep disdain that these centrist neoliberal types have for democracy, one, and two, they are going to fight tooth and nail to not acknowledge and rectify the role that they've played through all of their policy sets in terms of facilitating the rise of these people. And that's another way in which Brazil is this, in my view, it's just like this macro study of all of these trends. You've got everything. You've got these dead, discredited neoliberalism. You have the corrupted institutions. You have the hybrid warfare. You have the resurgent fascism. And then you even have, arguably the most extraordinary leader on the planet and a real social movement. So you have the positive variables too. Yeah,
it's pretty lame to call a situation like this and the people who live here as mediocre.
It's disgusting, but it's totally disgusting, but I think it's part of a very big attitude that you would hear across. I mean, I've heard that. Believe me, I've heard people who, they don't want to figure out how, why Hillary Clinton lost, right? It's just that the people felt her, she didn't fail the people.
Yeah.
It's a very broad attitude.
Right. It's not our model that's failed. The world failed our model.
That's it. And then you have the temerity to go and live in a place and have people, welcome you in a certain way for 15 years, interfere in people's internal affairs, facilitate the rise of a disastrous president, and then call them mediocre. That's that mindset.
And then shit on the people who who welcomed you to their country, basically.
Yeah, it's sick. It's disgusting.
But I agree. But we don't have that much time. I know you're busy. So I would kind of like to get back to this idea of asking you what you did, like both publicly and behind the scenes, to try and build up support for Lula's release from his political imprisonment. I remember seeing this guy at a Bernie Sanders campaign speech, who raised his hand in the back row and asked about Lula and yelled, "Lula, leave her." And I remember you commenting off the record, you thought this guy was someone who listened to your show. Could you just talk a little bit about what...
He was a listener. He was a watcher, for sure. Well, I mean, I can't go too much into private conversations, but I can tell you anybody that I knew who had any political clout whatsoever, and I do know some people like this, and some of those people definitely do watch my show and engage with it. They heard from me constantly about the Lula case, constantly. So that's number one, or I should say number two. I mean, number one was really my primary role with my show and the Majority Report, with the Michael Brooks Show and the Majority Report, and I just did a huge amount of segments on it, to the point where other people and friends, like as an example, I really want to mention my really good friend Anna Kasparian at the Young Turks. She ran with it. She started talking about it on TYT, which is also a really big independent platform. And I don't exactly know how it spreads. I just know that I started doing, because I do live shows for TMBS, and I'm in Chicago and LA, and these like kids from, wherever, guys in their 20s, some of them are wearing Lula t-shirts. We're saying Lula leave in the crowd. People understood that, number one, there was a U.S. role and that fit a bigger conversation, but also people got that this is this is an extraordinary leader. And even though you could play some things in translation, some of it's really simple. The guy lifted tens of millions of people out of poverty. I mean, and is communicating the values we're talking about, and has been taken off of the playing field by one of the most disgusting, corrupt processes anybody's ever seen. And so that was it. And people really resonated with the story. And then as it progressed, I could definitely tell you that, people sought my opinion on these types of things. And I know just the other day I was at a talk show, one of the major talk show hosts for the Young Turks, who's running for Congress now, when we talked about Lula. And the first thing he said is he goes, and they said, because there was just a profile about Bernie's foreign policy where they called Lula far left, which is, that's how the mainstream, the Trotskyites, the people on the left, he's a crypto right winger, and the mainstream press, he's, a communist here, there's no analysis. But I remember this guy, Jank, my friend Jank, he goes, I mean, I guess then that means that over 80% of the Brazilian people are far left, because he had an 80% approval rating when he left office. And I mean, I drilled that approval rating number. I mean, I can't tell you if you watch all the clips. And then, of course, I have to say, I mean, I was reading and still read Brazil Wire every day. I was having you on and I also was able to have on Valesca Martins and Celso Amorim. That's a whole other major part of this, is just being a conduit for voices on the ground in Brazil that actually know what the fuck they're talking about and represent the same I mean, would you go, if you want to know what's happening on the left in the United States, talk to me. Don't talk to somebody who supports Trump or Clinton.
Yeah, for sure. All right, well, this is just, the last question now, because time's running out. And I really, really appreciate everything you've done for Lula and everything. It's meant a lot.
My honor.
But what's going to happen now? We had this guy from intelligence with a long history of involvement in intelligence from the State Department visit these scumbag judges in Porto Alegre a couple days ago, saying that who ruled on, who denied Lula's appeal on this ridiculous vacation property case, which is even more ridiculous than the triplex apartment case, because there's even less. There's absolutely no evidence. The courts have already recognized that it's owned by the son of the former mayor of Campinas, which is one of the largest and richest cities in Brazil, which is a family that does not have money issues. It could easily afford to buy this kind of like moderately luxurious vacation house with a fish pond on it, So I don't know if you knew this. They said that Lula had this yacht, right, on this vacation, this luxurious vacation property. And when the police raided the place, they found a 14-foot aluminum fishing boat floating in the tilapia pond. That was Lula's yacht, and it didn't even belong to him. So
he's motherfucker.
I know. Ridiculous.
Jesus Christ. Well, that actually, you know what I have to say, for comedy, that actually helped, because when I would play footage when I was interviewing somebody like you or doing a commentary, and it included shots of this beachside luxury apartment, people would look at it and they would be like, "What?" They know, not like. But you get this image. You think like, oh, okay, our president's seaside condo. That's
presidential condo.
This is like where my grandmother lives in Jacksonville, Florida. Like, what are you talking about? Barack Obama is on a James Bond island with Richard Branson. Like, that's what we're used to. And we go look at that, we're just like, what? He couldn't afford that on his pension? Are you fucking kidding me? If he wanted it? It's embarrassing.
Yeah, really, it would be embarrassing as a citizen of a nation to think that a former two-time president would be even living in a place like that, really. Right. But, Lula has simple tastes, and he's been living in the same apartment. He doesn't like luxury, but even so... Yeah,
it's a testament to him. But look,
but he didn't live there, But the point is, I forgot what I was going to say. One little more extra point here before I get back to the intelligence. I don't know if you know this. When they seized his assets, after the New York Times, Guardian, all these papers reported it as if he'd built this, the Guardian said 44 million real fraud case he was in, or bribery case he was in, millions of dollars illicitly circulating around. They seized his bank account. And you know how much money was in it? Half of what Obama charges for one speech, like $200,000. That's all he had.
Well, this is the whole other thing, that we need to have a real conversation about what is and isn't corruption. That's a whole other thing, and that I focus a lot on my show. But I will say, the global right-wing movement, every single place they have won electorally, India, the United States, Brazil, Hungary, wherever, anti-corruption discourse is a major part of it. Major. Yeah. So that's a big, big problem that people think, they just hear that word corruption. And they also, the other point that I made to my audience too, that, gets a little bit trickier to articulate, but it's like, you need to understand the difference. They hear corruption, they think, okay, there's a fund that's set up to give people clean drinking water, and you take the cash and you stash it in your mattress, or you take a lobbying money from a pharmaceutical company or whatever. That's all corruption. But what they don't, well, maybe I'm running a country and I need to actually work with the system as it is to deliver things for people, is not corruption. That's called governing.
And it's called capitalism.
It's called, and that's the foundation, right? It's called capitalism, and that's how, right. So, but I think that we need to be really serious in the United States about understanding, and, just to make it simplified, in 2009, when the Obama administration backed the coup against Manuel Zelaya in Honduras, And obviously the Bush administration had been trying to dislodge Chavez the whole time. But let's just say 2009 is the beginning of the process of the US government basically saying, in various ways, not some secret conspiracy, but in terms of a shift in foreign policy, judicial, intelligence, and so on, and State Department, we don't want this pink tide thing to happen anymore. Because even the most moderate threads of it are basically saying we might protect vital geostrategic assets. We're not going to implement austerity programs at the drop of a hat. And we want to develop our own independent foreign policies and industries. And that's, look, that doesn't sit well with empire. I do think electing Bernie Sanders, I think it's really important. I mean, I'm not saying there's a whole bureaucracy that you go up against without, they call it the blob here, military defense. I mean, it was actually an Obama administration official who coined that because the blob went to war against them for cutting a deal with Iran. I mean, it's a very deeply, again, you can't think about it in a conspiratorial way, but it is a locked group with a locked set of policy preferences. And the only candidate who's talking about going up against it from the perspective of global solidarity is Bernie Sanders. And Ilhan Omar, when she endorsed him, said he is the only candidate to go up against Western imperialism. I got to tell you, to see a congresswoman who's a refugee, who I have nothing but admiration for, at a rally for a leading presidential candidate, a guy who could win, say Western imperialism, that blew my fucking mind. So there's a lot more to do. The situation is very dangerous. I have no doubt that people are working against Lula as we speak in the United States. But I do think awareness of the issues are rising. I was happy actually with the overall left, at least, with Bolivia, right up through Bernie Sanders, were totally clear. There wasn't any bullshitting about it. I mean, Bernie Sanders looked at Jorge Ramos and was like, that's called a coup. That's it. And so there's a lot, and there's also some people in the foreign policy world who are recognizing that the next phase, and it's much more difficult, but you can't just have a left critique, right? You can't just have left foreign policy people saying in the heart of empire that what we're doing is wrong. You need some people that are actually going to sit down and say, if we actually took over and wielded power, what would this actually look like? And so there are people having those conversations. And, a major part of it is pulling back from military engagements and slashing defense spending. But there's also a whole other conversation about debt relief and a whole other conversation about, just respecting other countries' sovereignty. It's funny because it really it's not that radical. It's
yeah.
It's
well,
very
that's the most
basic.
ironic thing, right?
Yeah.
When you look at Latin America, all of the coups happen against people who are like, FDR style Democrats or something. Right. But in any event, I feel like this conversation could go on for a long time.
It always does, my friend.
Sitting in a bar, drinking beers,
Yes.
somewhere talking this stuff, but I have to get off the air, and I know you're busy too. So thanks, and I hope to see you in Brazil soon, interviewing Lula. Because we're both trying to get this off the ground, right?
We got to go see and talk to President Lula very soon. That's very important. And because even still, using these independent platforms is the only way that you're still going to have a in-depth, unmediated conversation with people in the English-speaking world, which still matters a hell of a lot. And I just want to say besides that I'm honored, whatever small role I play. Please read Brazil Wire. And unlike Brian Winter, I think the people of Brazil are great.
All right, well.
Take care.
Thanks a lot. Take it easy.